do is talk about my next segment. In this next segment, I'm going to bring forth video from a guy who's been, well, between him and his father, they have been providing supplies and doing research to help reenactors for over 4 decades. And he's got almost as big a subscribership as Dave himself. Now, some of you are already smiling and saying, I know who Embarado is talking about. And for those of you who think I'm talking about John, you're correct. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce a guy whom even I listen to get information from. Now, granted, he doesn't come out with a whole lot that I don't already know, but he does from time to time find a gem that I've never heard of before. I've done some reenacting in my life, almost always as a First Nations member. I have only done from the other side one time, and that was as a mountain man trapper. And I just decided that just really wasn't me, per se, so I decided not to do that any further. The reenacting, period. This, though, was at a time when I was much younger. I decided I'd rather focus on actual doing in real life rather than just reenacting for other people's entertainment. I thought it would net me more. It did for a while, but anyhow, that's another story. So, for those who are not sure who John is that I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen, John from James Townsend and Son. I'm going to only have John speak basically on Suet. And I want you to understand when John talks about Suet, either rendered or unrendered Suet. When he's talking about the rendered Suet, what he's actually talking about is tallow. But he's speaking of it in the terms used during the 17th and 18th century. And for my younger viewers, that means from 1600 to 1800. The 17th century is the 1600s. The 18th century is the 1700s. You always mention a century by the last date ending in a 00 of that century. So 1800 is always attached to 1701 to 1800. And it's called the 18th century. I only take the time to explain this because it took me a long time to get my brain around it. So I'll try and save a little effort for some of my younger viewers who don't quite understand it yet. And I'm sure I could have done a better job of explaining it, but I got it through. So I'm going to let John explain to you about Suet and tallow. Please pay close attention. These are just clips from several of his videos, and I will include links down below in regards to the videos from which these clips came from. And I'll talk to you when we come back from that.
Today I'm going to be doing something a little different, a dish that was popular all the way from the mid-18th century to the 20th century, found in British cookbooks and also popular in colonial America. We're going to be making a hunter's pudding. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. A hunter's pudding is a type of plum pudding, and plum in this context means raisins. Plum puddings were often associated with special occasions, served during certain holidays or when visitors came to visit. The name Hunter's pudding may be a bit deceiving. We need to be careful about assuming that it was a favorite dish for backwoodsmen. Rather, a hunter's pudding was likely a pudding that would have been reserved for various special occasions, such as a formal hunt, popular from the mid-1700s up until the beginning of the 20th century. Let's get started. We're going to be making a recipe from The Lady's Assistant, a 1775 cookbook published from Charlotte Mason's manuscripts. We're making half batches today, so if you want to make a full-size batch, all you'll need to do is double the ingredients. It will change the cooking time, so we'll talk about that as we cook it. But to start, let's look at the ingredients. I'm using a half pound of flour and a half pound of suet. Now, when I say suet, I mean kidney fat. In a previous episode, we explored the difference between suet and hard muscle fat. And when it comes to making puddings, there's a huge difference. So if you go to your butcher to ask for suet, make sure he gives you kidney fat. If you can't find kidney fat to use, or if you have neither the time nor the inclination to render it yourself, James Townsend and Son now carries a Torah shredded suet. This suet is made from rendered kidney fat. It's stabilized with a little flour. Because it's rendered properly, it doesn't need refrigerated. In addition, we're using a half a pound of currants. Unlike the fleshy red berries that go by the same name and are related to the gooseberry, these currants are small, dried, seedless Corinthian grapes. There's a fascinating book from 1836 called The Backwoods of Canada. The book is comprised of letters of Catherine Parr Strickland Trail. She was the wife of a British officer who was given a land grant in Canada for his service during the war. The book starts in 1832 with their departure from Greenock, Scotland, and it follows their trip all the way through what is now Ontario. While this book was published in 1836, very little had changed in the way of life in the backwoods. So this book gives us a very good glimpse about what frontier life was like in the late 18th and early 19th century. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Today's recipe is a fairly simple one. We'll be doing a hasty pudding out of Maria Rundell's 1807 cookbook, A New System of Domestic Cookery. It's believed that puddings were introduced to English kitchens by the French during the Norman invasion of the British Isles during the 12th century. Their popularity exploded during the 14th century when someone discovered that you could boil these puddings in a cloth. The pudding bag allowed for puddings to be boiled alongside other courses. They were intended to serve as an economic filler so that less meat will be required to satisfy appetites. Boiling a full-size pudding can take 4 to 6 hours. Not a very practical dish for a frontier man or woman without the full amenities of a kitchen. So a hasty pudding is perfect for this setting, and a Dutch oven is the perfect vessel to cook it in. Now that our water is boiling, let's get started. Rundell's recipe omits all the measurements, so the measurements we're going to be giving you today are based off our experience. This recipe should make about 10 to a dozen small puddings. We're going to start by combining about 1 cup of fine breadcrumbs with a half a cup of currants or raisins, and the zest of a half a lemon, and a cup of grated suet. Instead of breadcrumbs, and the things you're really going to need for this recipe is beef suet or kidney fat. Make sure to check out our previous episode on suet for more information. Now back to our... In a recent episode, we made this meatless mince pie and we used vegetable shortening. Vegetable shortening is a late 19th century invention, but we suggested its use when suet is unavailable. First of all, let's look at exactly what suet is. Suet is the fat from the loin or kidney region of beef and mutton. It's going to be a completely different sort of fat that you're going to find on other parts of the animal. Muscle fat is completely different. Although it looks the same, they're not the same at all. They have completely different properties. They taste different, they smell different, and most importantly, they have a very different texture when they're finished. Here's a block of rendered suet. This is very much like a piece of soap or almost like a soft wax. It's very, very hard and set up at room temperature. But the regular fat that you're going to get, the muscle fat, when it's rendered, this is very different. This is, it never really sets up unless it's very cold. At room temperature, this is kind of cold in here right now, but at room temperature, it's almost liquid. So it's a completely different thing. Suet is also different than lard. It's definitely going to have a different flavor to it and a different melting point. When you're shopping for suet, it's likely you're going to have to ask your butcher. You aren't going to see it out on the shelf. When you ask your butcher, you can't just ask for suet. He'll trot out a bag of this hard, regular muscular fat, which of course isn't going to give you the right product. You really need to be specific, and you need to ask for kidney fat. And you can see inside of this suet, there's all this connective tissue. And all this stuff needs to be gotten rid of, or at least as much as possible. Inside of this connective tissue are little segments of suet. And even inside those little segments are smaller pieces of connective tissue. Sometimes you'll also run into blood vessels and other things that you need to separate out. So you just want to end up with these little cubes of the suet inside. Now that we've got this picked, it's really time to take all those pieces, these larger pieces, and dice them up very, very fine. But we've already done that with this batch that I've got here. We can take a look at this. Now, you can tell from this it's got a very particular texture. It's very fine, but it holds its shape. That's one of the reasons why they use it in pudding recipes. It makes little holes in the pudding. It stays its shape, and then as the pudding cooks, it turns into a liquid and leaves a little hole behind, giving it a light texture. You can get online from the UK a modern processed version of suet. This is similar. It's very similar in its texture, but it is a little different. It does have 15% flour put into it, and it's a dehydrated product, so it's been sort of industrially produced, and it probably won't exchange one for one in 18th century recipes. It's going to be a little bit different. One advantage to this modern suet product is that it's prepared and it will last a long time. It's shelf stable and will probably last a year or two. Our suet that we've got here is fresh, and it will not last very long. It has to be refrigerated or it will grow rancid very rapidly unless we further prepare it. To render this suet, we're going to need to heat it up very slow. You're going to need a pot. A cast iron pot is really good for this because it can withstand a lot of abuse. You don't want to have something like a copper pot that if you set it by the fire and you forget it, it's going to damage it. So the cast iron pot is perfect for this purpose. And what we do is take our cast iron pot, we're going to put our already minced up suet. We're going to pour it into this pot. And there, that's probably enough. We're going to set it close to the fire. We're going to set it right beside our fire. We're not going to put it in the fire or over the fire because we don't want to cook the suet. We're really just warming it up. We just want to get it so that we're separating this leftover connective tissue that's still in here with the oil or the fat that's inside the suet. I'm going to hang this near the fire, but I don't want to hang it directly over it or put it right in it. You definitely want to take your time on this. You want to keep a close eye on it. You don't want it to cook. You just want it to stay warm. This whole process is going to take several hours. You're going to want to come in here every once in a while and stir up the batch. If you're working in a modern kitchen, there's an easier way to do this, and that is with your slow cooker. You can take your diced suet and you can dump that in your slow cooker in the morning. Then you can set that on low or medium, go to work, and when you come home at night, it'll be ready. Our suet is all rendered down here. It's all completely melted. But of course, there's still some connective tissue that is floating around in here. In fact, earlier experiments that we've done with this has shown that even after we've pulled it all apart and diced it up, that it's still about 1/4 of this connective tissue. So you're going to get a yield of about 3/4 of this is going to be the good suet. I've got here, it's all melted, and I'm going to pour it through this sieve here to separate them out. If you don't have a sieve, then you can use a piece of cloth. There we go. These leftover little pieces of the connective tissue, those are called graves. And even in the 18th century, they had uses for this too. Now that we've got this strained, what I'm going to do while it's still in its molten state is to pour this off into a couple little pans I've got here. You can also pour this straight into a pan of water and let it solidify in that. And that also helps separate out some of the impurities. Our 18th century recipes call for, once this the suet has solidified, to actually take our cake and then wrap it in paper, and then wrap that paper in linen for long-term storage. Suet preserved in this way can last a long time, several months, and they used it in the 18th century for dozens of uses. It's used in puddings, pies, dumplings. It's also used in pickling and preserving. Here's some brandied peaches that are sealed off with suet. And it's also used in deep frying and grilling. In addition to those, there are many non-food uses.
Now, I'm not going to belabor this a whole lot, but as I said in some of my title shots in the middle of this, John is somebody I consider to be an expert and very well researched. And Dave should take a page out of his book. Oh. So that's all I've got for the moment. We've still got another segment of video that I may or may not add on here from a third channel. I tend to like to try and get permission in advance of using people's video when I'm going to use any kind of anything more than 10 or 15 seconds. I try to get advance permission. And so that's why I'm not mentioning this third channel just yet. When I get it, and I may or may not wait for permission for too much longer, but I do attempt to at least let the channels know and try and get them to respond in some fashion. And understand, tallow is a very useful item and can be used for anything that you would use a commercial fat product for. When I say a commercial fat product, that includes everything from a commercial tallow all the way out to WD-40. In most applications, tallow can be substituted. I mean, WD-40, woodcrafters, survivalists, preppers, homesteaders, what do we use WD-40 for the most? Protecting metal. Yes, we also use it for lubricating jointed metal, things like barrel pins on a door or the pivot point in a pair of pruning shears, or it's a lubricant, but it's also a metal protectant. And as a metal protectant, it can be substituted with tallow. Matter of fact, a far better job of it is done with tallow for just protecting metal surfaces, because it sticks and stays. It doesn't drip off and evaporate away. Because the clips that I'm using, let us be clear, fall under the fair use doctrine, because I'm going to be using them for the purpose of teaching and for the purpose of critique. Now you're saying to yourselves, Embarado, you're arguing with an expert. All you're doing is critiquing. Not so. Because my video not only will be a critique of Mr. Canterbury's failure to do his research properly and have the right answers before he makes his video, as he claims he likes to do, but it will also be a standalone teaching device, which I will use with my students. Yeah. The whole point is, I will use this video for my future students to watch, for them to get to understand that, yes, Embarado really does do the research. Now, don't misunderstand that. I have known since I was a child what tallow was, where it comes from, and what use it is. And just how useful it is. But that's not the... In this world... Oh, there goes my fine feathered friend flying off. The young eagle. In this world, it's not what you know, but who says you know it, in most cases. And this is something that Dave is already painfully aware of. I wasn't going to say much about this. I've stayed out of this. But a couple of years ago, Dave got himself in trouble. And a lot of you have seen his apology video. And for those of you who haven't, I will include a link to that down below. Suffice it to say, the whole point behind Dave's apology video was he fabricated something in the process of getting a job. And it came back to bite him right in the shorts. Because he claimed to know something, and then he made a claim of who it was that was backing up his knowledge of the item. And in doing so, that was his fabrication. All right, I'm just going to say it. He lied, and it came back and bit him in the shorts. He claimed he knew something and learned it through the military. He just learned it through trial and error, not from the military. He learned it by seeing people do it and then doing it himself. That's what I mean by trial and error. He learned it by watching YouTube videos. He learned it by watching other woodcrafters in person. Learned it from other people who taught at his school. Whatever. That he really does know a lot of the stuff he was claiming he knew when he got the job for dual survival. The trouble is, and here's the point, here's what got him in trouble, he claimed he knew it from his days in the military. No, he didn't. And when the people who ran that show found out, they canned his backside. So Dave knows what it is to feel like a ripe pineapple. Because somebody canned him. And for my younger viewers who don't get the joke, that's a line from Elvis Presley. From back in the, was that the 50s or the 60s? I believe the movie was Blue Hawaii. I think that was the title of it. Something or other Hawaii or Hawaiian something or other, but I'm not a huge Elvis fan. But some of the jokes that were made were funny. And yeah, that's the part I will remember, is when he would actually crack a joke. And as part of a song, he was cracking a joke. And I only listened to it because my mom was a diehard Elvis fan till the day she died. I personally don't see the attraction, but yes, I know guys that are that much diehard fans. I don't get it. Well, thank you very much. But honestly, I can say I don't know what it's like to be a ripe pineapple because I've never been canned, never been fired in my life. Dave knows what that feels like, though. I'm a bad boy. So we'll get into this third segment here in a minute. By the way, don't forget to